Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie, broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m, broadcasting on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter and on TikTok simultaneously. Good to see everybody coming in. Hello to the folks on TikTok. Hello to Danny. Hello to Francis. Hello to all the good folks. Please send in your comments and your thoughts on matters tonight. And I just want to give a big welcome to the first in the house, who was Derek Hart. Good evening. I hope you are well and welcome back. Also, good evening to fellow Brits around the world. Hope everyone is doing great. And Debbie, hello to you, says, delicious to see the SNP throwing their toys out of the pram once again. Well done to the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack. Indeed, he has surpassed himself. Many of us didn't think he would do it, but he has done it, and he has said to the SNP Green maladministration, which we have at Holyrood, he said, no, your law is a load of nonsense, and we cannot have that within the context of the United Kingdom. So thankfully, that has created a great deal of upset in the correct ranks, and all the SNP and Greens are all arguing with each other over whether or not they should have done what they did, and more about that in a moment. But it is, as Debbie says, delicious to see them all falling out with each other on that particular matter. Hello to Harry and all AFFG and unionists this evening. Francis Moon says, what do you think of the new law to have to show ID at the polling station to vote? I'm not sure it's a new law as yet, but anything that improves the integrity of the vote is absolutely essential, and anybody who would question the integrity of the vote is an enemy of democracy. If you're trying to make voting easier, and if you are trying to ensure that it's very easy to rig it, then you don't believe in democracy. So anything that tightens up the integrity of the vote is essential if democracy is to continue into the future. Hello to Ryan and to Catherine and to Stuart from Elgin, and also to Derek. Good to see Derek, and of course D Stanners in the house. And to Tom, hello to all fellow unionists. And Jeff, who says, thank you for your hard work. Yes. And Sean goes, what do you think of Douglas Ross? Well, we've got one or two points that we're going to make about that whole thing later in the programme, including Douglas Ross also. And on TikTok, we've also got our shop has been launched also on TikTok, and we are going to be working on selling items via TikTok, which is amazing, including this little badge. There you go. Now, let us talk about this carry on at the moment, which is great news from a pro-UK perspective, which is that yesterday the Secretary of State for Scotland said that the Scottish National Party and the Greens, we call them the SNP Greens, the SNP Green maladministration is not able to achieve royal assent for their gender recognition reform bill. Now, royal assent means that it has to, before it can become a law, it has to be signed off by the King. And if the government of the day, which is to say the British government, doesn't approve of that law, then it will advise the King not to sign it, and so the law will not pass. The bill will not pass into law, and that's what's happened here. And what's the background of all of this? Okay, well, as you know, we have devolution in the United Kingdom. And devolution in Scotland is a consequence of the Scotland Act 1998, which was passed by the Labour government of the day. And they built one small safeguard into it in a law that had holes all the way through it as far as the integrity of the United Kingdom is concerned. But they built one small safeguard into it, amazingly so, really, quite frankly, that they even had the wherewithal to think of putting in at least one safeguard. But they put in one safeguard, and it's called Section 35. And I'll just bring that up on the screen for you, for viewers on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and I'll read it out. The Section 35, there it is there, and it says, Section 35, power to intervene in certain cases. If a bill contains provisions which the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe would be incompatible with any international obligations or the interests of defence or national security, or which make, and this is the crucial bit, which make modifications of the law as it applies to reserved matters, and which the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe would have an adverse effect on the operation of the law as it applies to reserved matters, then he may make an order prohibiting the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament from submitting the bill for royal assent. In other words, that's not going to be a good law, because it's going to impact in some way matters which are properly reserved to the wider UK government. And so they'll advise the presiding officer that that's a bill that cannot be put into law. And that's all that's happened. Now, that is obvious, right? That's, if you have devolved matters and if you have reserved matters, you've got to ensure that the devolved matters are not going to conflict with the wider UK law. And the wider UK law here is something called the Equality Act, which was brought in 2010 by the then Labour government. And there's a lot wrong with the Equality Act, quite frankly, and we can get to that in a moment. But what you're looking at here is that the Equality Act contained some things which are on their face fairly uncontroversial. You know, things like, oh, everybody should be treated equally under the law. Okay, so let's actually make that an official law. And, you know, nobody's really going to disagree with that. But what they then do with this concept of equality is they stretch it and stretch it and stretch it. It's a very elastic concept, a very elastic idea. And they can stretch it as far as they want. They can stretch it to the point of view where, oh, if a man identifies as the back end of a horse, then if you're his employer, you have to follow him around all day with a shovel and clean up his shit, basically. And if you don't do that, then you're the bad guy. Okay? So it's a very elastic concept which can be stretched indefinitely. And so there's a lot wrong with that. But that's where we are at the moment. So anyway, we have this equality law which is reserved, and it goes throughout the United Kingdom, and it's the British government that has to look at that. And what they're saying is that this particular law in Scotland is going to cause difficulties throughout the rest of the UK if people have signed up to this gender recognition reform in Scotland and then they move to the other parts of the United Kingdom where that's not the law. That's going to cause trouble with the Equality Act. It's going to be a conflict in there. And so they can't, understandably, whatever you may think about the Equality Act, obviously they can't have that. So it's that technical reason that they have prohibited it. So that's the background. But that's how devolution is meant to work. You know, you get Nicola Sturgeon at the moment going on about how this is an assault on devolution. No, it's not. It's how devolution is meant to work. Okay? We're not living in a federal state. We're not living in an separated Scotland. We're living in a United Kingdom that has devolved areas, but who these devolved areas have to answer to the wider British picture run by the British Parliament, the central British Parliament. And we put this together once in a graphic, how to understand devolution, how devolution is meant to work. We explain in here how devolution is intended to compensate for the minority representation of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales in the collective British Parliament. Okay, because of the various sizes of the four parts of the United Kingdom, England dominates in that sense. It has 533 of the 650 MPs. Okay, now from the ideal of a Scottish and British unionist, these 650 MPs should not be voting for their own parts of Britain. They should be voting for the policies and ideologies of their party without specific consideration of whether they're voting as an Englishman, a Scotsman, a Welshman or a Northern Irishman. They should be voting as Britons for the United Kingdom's best interests. However, if you're a Scottish nationalist, you very much break that up and you say, oh no, Scotland is hugely underrepresented as a nation per se. And so devolution is meant to compensate for that underrepresentation of the nations. But it's the nations within the United Kingdom as one unitary state. But it's how devolution is meant to work. And if you don't like that, then what you have to argue for is separation. You have to argue for independence if you don't like the way that it's working at the moment. And of course, Scottish nationalists don't. But what I don't like about it is that they refuse to explain or understand devolution. And they misrepresent devolution. They misrepresent it as if we're living in a federal state where Scotland can do what it wants and England can do what it wants, or if we're living already in an independent nation. They portray the reality all wrong. It's really upsetting to see the extent to which they misrepresent devolution, and they try to pretend that devolution is something other than what it is. Not just the Scottish National Party, it's the Labour Party that are doing this as well. And it seems that even though the Labour Party set up devolution, they don't really understand what devolution is meant to be or how it's meant to work. And even the Labour Party and Lib Dems are falling into the idea that Sturgeon should get her way all the time, or that the Scottish Parliament should get its way all the time, without proper cognizance of the rest of the United Kingdom, without understanding the relationship with the United Kingdom Parliament. And you see that. And the Labour Party, we put out a tweet today, the Labour Party needs to understand that devolution is not a blank policy slate for the devolved areas. The devolved areas can't just do what they want, not within devolution. If they're separated, if they're independent, they can do what they want. But within devolution, it's not a blank policy slate just to do what you want. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's not meant to allow devolved policies at the expense of the wider United Kingdom. That's why we have a Section 35. A devolved part of the United Kingdom can't make up a law that is going to be bad for the rest of the United Kingdom, or it's going to cause problems for the rest of the United Kingdom. You can't do that within devolution. And thirdly, devolution is not some kind of Trojan horse that a devolved parliament can use against the integrity of the union. It's not some kind of Trojan horse where you can get in there and you can use it in order to undermine the union. That's not the point of devolution. And it's not meant to be some kind of battering ram against whoever happens to be the UK government at the time. It's not a Trojan horse, and it's not meant to be a battering ram. So that's where we are at the moment. But from a unionist perspective, it's very good that once again the proper devolutionary relationship has been clarified. And if the Scottish National Party Greens don't like that, and even if the Labour and Lib Dems don't like it, that's too bad. They're going to have to learn what devolution is and how devolution is meant to work. We shout out to Dave Score. So, just Dave, hello. Northern Ireland says British and proud. Says hello from Northern Ireland. Good to see you, sir. Kevin says something that's very important. They shouldn't have allowed the SNP to call themselves the Scottish Government. It used to be called the Scottish Executive. Absolutely. And they should stop that nonsense, because that's what confuses people. Because if you don't understand that the devolutionary arrangement, then, and if you think that somehow Holyrood is on the same par as Westminster, then you're going to think that they're both the same governments, and you're going to not understand why Scotland can't get its way all the time. So words do mean things, and words can really confuse the issue. The phrase Scottish executive helped us to understand the relationship, which was not a linear horizontal relationship between the two, but it was rather one with the British Parliament being the overarching parliament, with the branches coming off it, which were the devolved assemblies that were not on the same par as the central British government. But that word government, that confused the relationship, and that's why there's so many Scottish nationalists now, because they think that the Scottish government should be the same as the British government. It really confused the relationship, and I don't see how that's going to get better, because even Rishi Sunak is constantly falling into that particular trap. Alan says that he saw the SNP leader at Prime Minister's questions today, and he comes across as a dangerous man. Potnoodle says, words do matter. What is a nation? That's a very good question, and we addressed Britain, a unitary state, and a nation in our magazine here. Do more together. You'll get that answer from our journal. Catherine says, Alistair, you're knocking it out the park. Thank you. And Harvey believes what quite a lot of people believe, which is the SNP are kicking the independence can down the road and dragging all the yesers with them. I think that's so. There's certainly not going to be a referendum this year or even next year. Michael says, hello, Union Man. A point there was made about democracy on TikTok, and how does this relate to democracy? Well, you see, we are certainly here in Scotland and in Britain, we're a democracy, but we're more than that. We're a constitutional democracy, which means that we have laws, that our democracy operates by laws. And these laws are there because everybody has to be protected, even the people who disagree with the majority. And democracy isn't just simply about sheer weight of numbers, voting on one day several years ago, therefore that somehow that allows the government of the day to shoehorn in whatever policy it wants for its 5-year period. It has to be controlled by laws, whether that's the British government or by the people in Scotland. We need laws in our democracy, and thankfully we have them. So when people complain about what they think is a lack of democracy, no, it's not. It's just the laws are working properly, the structure is working properly. It's not anti-democratic to disallow the Gender Reform Act, whatever it's called, at Holyrood. It's not an undemocratic act. That's the way that the British Constitution works. That's the way that the Scotland Act 1998 works. That's the law of the land. It ensures these things. It's nothing to do with democracy. Democracy is not being denied. And this is a big issue, though, because this word is really, really pushed, not just by the SNP MPs and MSPs, but by the Scottish National Party Television, otherwise known as STV, by all the media. They really do push this anti-democratic angle, and people like ourselves and all the sensible people can say, well, you know, we have a constitution in this country, we have laws that must be followed, we have the Supreme Court, we have this and that, and all of that's correct, but sometimes just the loud voice just dominates, you know. And I'll talk about this in a moment, but I saw this terrible interview with Rishi Sunak and this oafish STV political editor. Oh, oafish, loudmouthed, aggressive fool of a man. And he was just berating Sunak. Not that I've got great love for Sunak, but I just thought, you know, what a loudmouthed, aggressive STV political editor. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. Double O Mo says devolution is simply anti-UK. Stuart says you should team up with Neil Oliver. That would be a good show. Yeah, and was it yesterday? Some Scottish BBC newsreader, I mean, I don't know who watches BBC Scotland, but a few people anyway. Somebody called Laura McIver referred to Nicola Sturgeon as our leader. Our leader, right? She missed out the word dear. It should have been our dear leader. Derek says, great show, guys. Keep up the good work. Harvey says, don't watch the British Broadcasting Corporation. Just Dave says, can you please answer my point? I'm not sure what the point was, Just Dave. I'll scroll back. William says, do you invite others for debate? We usually have guests. We don't have a guest for tonight, but we'll have hopefully a guest next week, and we'll definitely have a guest the week after. And you won't necessarily see the guest on TikTok unless you headed over to YouTube. But yeah, we do have guests, and we're happy to debate with anybody who invites us on in good faith. Right, on this day in British history, because you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you are if you don't know where you have been. And it was on this day in British history that I'm going to call him an epitaph creator. You know, we see all these war memorials, tragic war memorials from the First World War around towns and villages throughout the United Kingdom, and on them are written things like, their name liveth forevermore, known unto God, and the glorious dead. Well, who came up with those slogans? Well, it was none other than our man Rudyard Kipling, who died on this day, 18th of January in 1936. And let's throw up a photograph of him there. And this is a photograph from a cigarette card. There he is, Rudyard Kipling, from the Kensitas cigarette cards. And he came up with those phrases, although he took their name liveth forevermore from the King James version of the Apocrypha, Ecclesiasticus 44:14. He found that in the Apocrypha. And as I say, he also came up with the phrases known unto God and the glorious dead. And he was born on the 30th of December in 1865 in British India, in Bombay. And Rudyard means red yard. And he was named after Rudyard Lake in Staffordshire, where his parents had met. And he was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium. And his ashes are interred at Westminster Abbey. And on the back of that card, that Kensitas cigarette card, we see it's a series of 50. A series, builders of empire. A series of 50. Rudyard Kipling, born in India and educated in England. He returned to India in 1882 and took up journalism. In 1886, he began to publish his poems and stories, which attracted world attention. I like this bit. They lauded men who, without hope of reward, built up the empire abroad and poured contempt on those who were unable to visualize the empire's greatness. I like that. I'm going to say it again. And he poured contempt on those who were unable to visualize the empire's greatness. Through his influence, a new and finer conception of the empire was instilled into the public mind. He is rightly called the poet of empire. Before his time, the common soldier was considered a social outcast. Kipling showed that Tommy Atkins was the backbone of the British Empire, and he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1907. And that's brought to you courtesy of Kensitas, the mild cigarette, which is just what the doctor ordered. Just what the doctor ordered. Those were the days of cigarettes. And you got what the doctor ordered, and you also got, and on this day, education about the nation. And where do you get that these days? You buy a packet of fags, hate to think what's in there. Probably nothing. Probably a message from Nicola Sturgeon telling you to put the fags down and don't smoke. The First Minister, or who knows which, will be telling you what to do. Anyway, that was on this day 18th of January 1936, when Kipling passed away. I'll ask you a question about that in a moment. Let's check out some comments here. Michael says Bonnie Prince Charlie was an Italian. I'm not quite sure about that. Yes, George, we love the Empire. And the Empire was funny as hell. It absolutely was. And people who don't like the British Empire, I'm afraid, need to think again. They really do. Thomas says Rule Britannia. Lita says hello from Luni, Finland. Oh yeah. What's Luni? Stuart says I have Kipling's collected poems. Wordsworth Poetry Library. Excellent. Good. He wrote quite a few good poems on British history and empire and things like that. Becky says, I remember saving the cards from Benson and Hedges, and my nana had a catalogue for hers from our embassy mild. Absolutely. I've got a catalogue in the office here. Great Britons. I should have brought that out tonight. Scotia mentions 1314. Harry says that he saw a video from Dan Hannan on YouTube talking about why free trade with the Commonwealth is better rather than free trade with the EU. He did all this in the House of Lords, and it was super interesting. I meant to just mention about the Glasgow Cabbie event, which was last week. We've got a couple of pictures I want to put out about that. That was on the 12th. I had mentioned it the previous week when I was broadcasting here on the 4th to tell you that it was coming up, and went very well. Several hundred people outside the Holyrood chanting Sturgeon out. Quite a lot of our supporters were there, not in any official AFFG capacity, but just to show support for the organiser Glasgow Cabbie. Glasgow Cabbie has a taxi for Sturgeon. That's a good one. And the Scottish media, of course, ignored it, and there was no media channels that were aware of reported it, although interestingly the Sunday Telegraph did report it, and there's a photograph of another banner, Sturgeon, betrayer of women and children. It's an article that appeared in the Saturday edition it appeared in the Sunday Telegraph. Sturgeon's toxic politics can't be allowed to contaminate the rest of the UK. And that's it, isn't it? Sturgeon's toxic politics cannot be allowed to contaminate the rest of the UK. And when the rest of the UK needs to be protected, then it needs to step in and say, your toxic politics cannot be allowed to contaminate us. And that's what has happened at the moment, and that's why the Scottish National Party supporters and the Green Cabbage supporters are all in a tizzy about this. Well, somebody says there about the British Tory party plundering and destroying everything. Does that annoy us as much as Sturgeon's politics? Probably yes. If you're going to use that dramatic language, we would certainly say yes. We're not party political in any particular way, and we are against much of what the British establishment does, and I think you've got to be careful not to imagine that unionists are all of one kind, because we're certainly not. And if you have bad government, you have bad government. Doesn't matter whether it's in Britain or in Sturgeon land. But Sturgeon is particularly awful. I think you have to accept that. And the idea that her and her compatriots are going to be any better when they get independence, so-called, is it's a pipe dream. I mean, it will be terrible. So, yeah, what was I going to talk about? Yeah, Rishi Sunak's visit to Scotland. He arrived last Friday, and I was just thinking about this today, and I thought to myself, why does he have to come up to Scotland to meet Nicola Sturgeon? If I was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, I would sit there in 10 Downing Street and I would invite in my devolved First Ministers to come to Downing Street. I'd say, you want to meet me? Come and visit me. Okay, you come to the mountain. Okay, I don't go to you, as the phrase has it. So this idea that he's got to trek up to visit Her Highness at Bute House is the wrong way round. You're the Prime Minister. If your devolved minister wants to speak with you, she should come and visit you wherever you happen to be. And maybe you have like a Scottish office or something like that. She comes to the Scottish office. She comes to Queen Elizabeth House in Edinburgh to meet you. You don't go off to meet her somewhere. Now, he did meet Nicola Sturgeon. I'm not quite sure where, but it certainly, thankfully, wasn't in Bute House, so he didn't have to do the degrading going up the steps while she stands at the top of the steps of Bute House looking down upon him contemptuously as he struggles up there, like what Boris Johnson did and what Theresa May did. And the spectacle of that was so degrading to them. Unbelievable that they were advised to do that. Anyway, Rishi Sunak thankfully did not do that, but he still got it the wrong way round in that really she has to come to visit him. He shouldn't have to go to visit her. Anyway, that aside, he got interviewed by Scottish National Party Television, otherwise known as STV. And I struggle whether I should actually play this interview because it's unbelievable. This wee Rishi, right, facing this loudmouthed, aggressive, angry oaf of a man who is apparently the political editor of STV. Political editor? This guy couldn't even edit his own underwear, for crying out loud. Yet he's meant to have an opinion on edit politics in Scotland. Unbelievable. Anyway, Rishi was there. Rishi was there to tell us all the good news about how 2 free ports were being delivered for people in Scotland. And this oaf man was having none of it. All he wanted to do was go, "What about democracy for the people of Scotland?" No, he didn't even say people of Scotland. He said Scottish people, which is even more emotive and even more inaccurate. Okay? As if we're all agreed with Oafman Colin, for that is his name. As if we're all agreed with him. And Rishi, poor old Rishi, is like the enemy of the people or something like that. And Rishi's trying to explain what free ports are. And I don't even know what a free port is, but I'd like to know. And since it seems to be good news, then maybe Oafman Colin could have let Rishi say his words and find out what it's about, you know. But Oafman Colin was having none of it. Absolutely was having none of it. And was getting really aggressive in his tone also. And I thought, that's just awful. That's just awful. And he was raising all these straw man arguments. Like, he goes straight in. He goes, "Would you accept the result of a de facto referendum?" By which he meant that if at the Westminster election or if at a Holyrood election, a majority of people who voted on the day voted for the SNP or the Green Cabbages, would you accept that de facto referendum? And Rishi's going, "Well, but I'm just here to talk about free ports and to talk about how we're delivering for the people of Scotland." And Oafman Colin keeps going on and on about a de facto referendum because he's already decided it's going to be a de facto referendum. It's not, would it even be a de facto referendum? It's a de facto referendum, and would you accept it? And Rishi just was not answering that. Oafman Colin was getting more angry and more angry and more angry. And then he starts going on about how this is against democracy and against, let me just actually, Rishi's trying to keep talking about free ports, and the STV so-called political editor is going, "Are you saying that the Scottish people have no democratic right to express their own opinion on Scotland's democratic future?" That's a totally straw man argument to bring in democracy. To imagine that democracy is somehow being denied in Scotland is a straw man argument, which means that you build up an idea which is not a real fact, and then you attack it. It's pretending that something is happening when that's not the case. And in this case, pretending that there's no democracy in Scotland. Well, you see, the people of Scotland decide their democratic future every time they go to the ballot box, whether that's at a local election or whether it's at a Scottish election or whether it's at a British parliamentary election or perhaps at a referendum. You're always, when you vote, you're deciding Scotland's future. So the people of Scotland have democracy. We express our democratic opinion on Scotland's future every single time that we vote. That's the constitutional reality of the matter. But anyway, it was an extremely biased interview, and I'm not going to play it. But the three main takeaways for me were simply that STV, especially STV, but also BBC Scotland, will push a hostile environment for pro-UK politicians from Westminster, whether that's Sunak or whether it's Starmer, whenever they come to Scotland. Okay, the Scottish media will push a hostile environment for pro-UK politicians from Westminster, whether Sunak or Starmer. And two, they're not interested in why these politicians came up to Scotland. They're only interested to use them as props to push the SNP agenda, to push the democracy being denied agenda. And the third takeaway for me from that as well was that they will use straw man arguments based on the false concept of some kind of denial of democracy in order to aggressively push their anti-UK agenda. And that's what they'll do. So if you're the Prime Minister, you have to ask, what's the point of even talking to STV or even BBC Scotland? You have to make up that decision for yourself, of course, but there may be no real point. If you're just going to be used as a prop, what's the point of even talking to them? Anyway, we are certainly a democracy here, thank goodness, but we're more, as I always say, than a democracy. We're a constitutional democracy, which means that we have laws that must be obeyed and laws that protect us all. And thankfully they protect us from the over-emotional, politically illiterate SNP and Green supporters. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Imagine if they got their way. STV Colin is an SNP puppet planted there, I'm convinced, says Alan. Tend to agree that he's an SNP fanboy, no question about that. And yeah, says Alan, the SNP should not be allowed to run on a mandate that involves policies that they have no powers over. Becky says that the SNP have apparently lost a lot of support now, which is always good. And Alba seems to have gone quiet. Ryan says the UK government has temporarily grown a backbone in issuing the Section 35 order. The fact that it has been used at all is further evidence of the failure of legislative devolution. Yes, as Alan says, Rishi didn't go to Butte House to be paraded by her in front of her row of saltires. I want to just bring attention to this article. The SNP's latest separatist plot must be defeated. And this is by David Frost. And he's talking about, this was written just a few days ago, so it's before the Section 35 order was written. And he points out the fact that Scotland is a historic nation within the unitary UK state with certain powers devolved from the centre. That's just what we were saying earlier. Now mostly incompetently exercised, as the decline in Scottish education standards or the shocking ferry procurement saga illustrate. The SNP want discussion of those devolved powers to be taboo. It must not be. Devolution has gone too far, and the SNP is able to exploit for its own purposes powers on many issues normally exercised at the British national level. For example, why does Scotland get to run its own census badly, exercise its own public health powers during the pandemic, or have its own food standards? Of course, all of these things should never, ever have been tolerated, and a lot of that is because devolution is the wrong way round, as I always say. And as we wrote in our journal here, Do More Together, get devolution the right way round. The way that it is at the moment is that everything is permitted, everything is devolved, except that which is written down as reserved. And what that means is if that you forgot to write it down as reserved, then it's permitted. And that's why you have things like the census being run separately. Goodness me, if the British state needs anything, it needs one unitary census, but they forgot to write that down as reserved. And so, as I say, everything is permitted under the so-called settlement. And so the SNP can just expand into all of these areas that have not been written down as reserved. The proper way to do devolution is that you write down only that which is devolved, and everything else is presumed to be reserved. And we explain that here in our magazine, Do More Together, which you can get at our shop. This is a 40-page magazine, which is in itself an education in authentic unionism. And Lord Frost here finishes, the British government, any government at Westminster, must recognise that it is in a political struggle with the SNP for the future of the country. A political struggle for the future of the country. It must stand up for the more than half of the population of Scotland that does not want independence, yet must live with the prospect that if politics suddenly turns against them, their whole national identity, British, their lives, their families, their pensions, the contents of their own bank accounts, if they've managed to accumulate any within a Scottish tax regime even more punitive than England's, could be upended at short notice. That struggle won't be won by appeasing the SNP. That can't be done. The modern rotten borough of SNP Scotland must instead be fought, defeated, and then reformed by exercising political power strategically and seriously over time. That has to start by using Section 35 next week. Well, Section 35 was used, and let's hope that that leads into a more carnivorous rather than herbivorous attitude of the government towards the SNP Green maladministration, which has been getting away with far too much and has been undermining the United Kingdom. And as he said there, if they get their way, so many people are going to lose so much. And so if you want to help the fight back, do please support us, because we're on the front line, and you can do that by buying our wee book for the Union. It's only a £5, folks, and it is a great introduction into what the United Kingdom and this unitary state is. We've also got other stuff in our shop. Stuart enjoyed the show. Thank you, Stuart. Good to have you on as always. Very informative show. That's top of the hour, so we're going to bring the show to an end. Thank you very much for watching. We will be back next week, same time, 7 to 8. Thank you very much to everybody who sent in your comments. Thank you to everybody who's been watching. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Got a lot to get through. I'm going to try to put some of that into an article which we'll put out on our website this week, bringing some of those thoughts together because they need to be said in an article. So until next week, it just remains for me to say God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next week.